Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that started in a lab, became a miracle drug, won a war, melted into soccer moms' medicine cabinets, and eventually turned into one of the most destructive substances on Earth, methamphetamine. Not the Breaking Bad kind, well, actually exactly the Breaking Bad kind, but with way more context and a lot less cinematography. We're talking about a chemical that went from keeping fighter pilots awake to helping housewives lose weight, destroying entire communities. So before you settle in, hit like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. Thanks to everyone who suggested this topic. I appreciate it. We're now live on Spotify, so check the description for the link. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. And yeah, we all remember that egg in the frying pan. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe hide your Sudafed because apparently that's a thing now. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a pharmaceutical company's diet pill became a street drug? How did Japanese kamikaze pilots, American truckers, and rural cooks in trailer parks all end up using the same substance? Was there really a time when doctors just handed this stuff out? What happened when an entire generation of women were casually taking legal meth to fit into their dresses? And how did we go from take 2 pills for pep to one of the most addictive drugs in human history? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1893 in a Japanese laboratory. You're a chemist named Nagayoshi Nagai. You've just synthesized something new from ephedrine, and you have absolutely no idea what you've just unleashed on the world. Good luck. Let's talk about how this all started. With complete innocence and zero malice, you're Nagayoshi Nagai, a Japanese chemist in 1893, and you're working with a plant extract called ephedrine, derived from a shrub that's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. You're not trying to create a super stimulant that will later fuel armies, ruin lives, and dominate rural America. You're just doing chemistry, the patient, methodical kind that involves careful measurements, controlled reactions, and meticulous note-taking. In your lab, surrounded by glass beakers and Bunsen burners, you successfully isolate a new compound through a process of reduction. You write it down in your notes. Methamphetamine. It's a derivative of ephedrine, structurally similar but chemically distinct. You document the synthesis, publish your findings in an academic journal, and move on to your next project. The compound sits there in the scientific literature, completely harmless, completely ignored, like a loaded gun with no one around to pull the trigger. This is important to understand. Nagai wasn't a villain. He wasn't even careless. He was a scientist doing what scientists do, exploring, discovering, documenting. The molecule he created had no inherent morality. It was just a chemical structure, carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen arranged in a particular way. What happened next wasn't his fault. He couldn't have predicted it. How could he possibly know that this obscure compound, tucked away in a Japanese chemistry journal, would one day fuel the Nazi war machine, become a staple in American medicine cabinets, and eventually devastate entire communities across the globe? For decades, methamphetamine remains exactly where Nagai left it, in the academic record, gathering dust. Other chemists occasionally reference his work, but nobody sees any particular use for this new stimulant. Ephedrine itself is already known to have stimulating properties. It increases heart rate, opens airways, and provides a modest energy boost. But methamphetamine, that's just a footnote, a chemical curiosity, a molecule waiting for someone to realize what it can do. And here's the thing about scientific discoveries. They're neutral. They don't care about your intentions. Dynamite can clear mountains for roads or blow up buildings. Nuclear fission can power cities or level them. And methamphetamine, in the right hands, under the right circumstances, it could keep a pilot awake during critical mission, or help a soldier march through impossible terrain. In the wrong hands, it could destroy lives with ruthless efficiency. But in 1893, none of that has happened yet. Nagai has simply added a new compound to humanity's chemical library. The book is on the shelf. Someone just needs to check it out. Fast forward to post-World War I Germany, where pharmaceutical companies are racing to turn every chemical compound into a miracle cure. The country is rebuilding, the economy is struggling, and the pharmaceutical industry sees opportunity everywhere. If you can synthesize it, you can sell it. And what people want desperately is energy. Enter Akira Ogata, a Japanese chemist who in 1919 takes Nagai's work a step further. Ogata synthesizes a crystalline form of methamphetamine that's easier to produce, more stable, and significantly more potent. He does this through a different chemical process, one that yields a purer product. Again, there's no malicious intent. Ogata is simply refining the science, improving the synthesis. But this crystalline form, this is the version that will eventually flood the world. German scientists at Temmler Pharmaceutical Company are paying attention. They look at Ogata's work and see potential. Germany in the 1930s is a nation obsessed with productivity, efficiency, and strength. The Nazi ideology glorifies the strong, the energetic, the tireless. And here's a chemical that can make you feel exactly that way. Temmler starts developing methamphetamine for commercial use, and in 1938 they release it under the brand name Pervitin. The marketing is aggressive and shameless. Pervitin is advertised as a cure for depression, a treatment for narcolepsy, and most importantly a weight loss aid and performance enhancer. Feeling tired? Take Pervitin. Feeling sad? Take Pervitin. Need to stay awake for a long drive? Pervitin. Want to lose a few pounds? Pervitin, Pervitin, Pervitin. It's sold in pills, it's sold in chocolate, it's sold without a prescription. You can walk into a pharmacy and buy methamphetamine as easily as buying cough syrup. And people do. Students use it to cram for exams, pulling all-nighters fueled by chemical energy. Truck drivers pop Pervitin to stay awake on long hauls across the countryside. Housewives take it to clean their homes with manic efficiency and shed those stubborn extra pounds. Factory workers use it to power through grueling night shifts. The drug is everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life. At this point, nobody understands addiction the way we do now. The concept exists, sure, but it's mostly associated with opiates and alcohol. Stimulants like Pervitin are seen as fundamentally different, helpful, energizing, safe. After all, they're sold in pharmacies. They're made by respectable companies. Doctors recommend them. What could possibly go wrong? Here's what's happening beneath the surface. Methamphetamine floods the brain with dopamine, triggering intense feelings of euphoria and energy. It suppresses appetite, eliminates fatigue, and creates a sense of invincibility. But the brain isn't designed to handle this level of stimulation. Tolerance builds quickly. The dose that worked yesterday doesn't work today. You need more, and more, and more. But in 1938, that's all still ahead. Right now, Pervitin is a miracle drug, a pharmaceutical success story, and proof that modern chemistry can solve any problem. The Nazis are about to take this miracle drug and turn it into a weapon. It's September 1939, and Nazi Germany is about to invade Poland. The strategy is called Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. The idea is to move so fast, strike so hard, and overwhelm the enemy so completely that they can't respond. But there's a fundamental problem with this strategy. Human beings need sleep. Soldiers get tired, tank crews get exhausted, pilots lose focus. You can drill discipline into troops, you can inspire them with ideology, but you can't change biology. Unless you have Pervitin. The Wehrmacht starts distributing methamphetamine to its soldiers on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. We're talking millions of pills. During the invasion of Poland and France, German soldiers are issued Pervitin as standard rations. Some units receive tablets before missions, others get them during extended operations. Pilots flying long-range bombing missions take them to stay alert. Tank crews use them to maintain focus during multi-day advances, and it works. Terrifyingly well. German soldiers march for days without rest, covering distances that should be physically impossible. They fight through exhaustion, push through pain, and maintain an aggressive tempo that overwhelms their enemies. The speed of the blitzkrieg isn't just tactical brilliance, it's chemically enhanced. The Allies are facing an army that literally doesn't sleep. One particularly well-documented case involves the invasion of France in 1940. German forces advanced through the Ardennes forest and pushed toward the coast at a pace that shocked military observers. Soldiers later reported marching for 50 miles without significant rest, fighting on minimal sleep, and feeling almost superhuman. That wasn't courage or training alone. That was Pervitin. But methamphetamine doesn't just affect soldiers. Adolf Hitler himself becomes a daily user, though his drug of choice is injectable methamphetamine provided by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. Starting around 1942, Hitler receives regular injections of what Morell calls vitamins, but what are actually cocktails of stimulants, including methamphetamine. The drug use accelerates as the war turns against Germany. By the later years of the war, Hitler is exhibiting classic signs of stimulant abuse: paranoia, erratic decision-making, wild mood swings, and physical deterioration. His increasingly delusional military strategies, holding positions at all costs, refusing to retreat, believing in miracle weapons that don't exist, may be partly influenced by chronic methamphetamine use. The man directing the war effort is high. Meanwhile, back on the home front, Pervitin is still being sold to civilians. Housewives are taking it to manage their households while their husbands are at war. Factory workers producing war materials are using it to maintain productivity. The entire German nation is running on methamphetamine, from the front lines to the assembly lines. By 1940, the German military has distributed more than 35 million tablets of Pervitin. By some estimates, the total reaches over 200 million by the end of the war. But the consequences are starting to become apparent. Soldiers are collapsing from exhaustion once the drug wears off. Some develop psychosis. Others become addicted, unable to function without their pills. Reports of erratic behaviour, violence and breakdowns start filtering back to command. In 1941, the German military begins restricting Pervitin use, requiring prescriptions and limiting distribution. But it's too late. The drug is already embedded in military culture, and soldiers find ways to get it through unofficial channels. The genie is out of the bottle, and it's not going back in. Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg was powered by more than ideology and tactics. It was powered by methamphetamine, one pill at a time. Not to be outdone, the Allies look at what the Germans are doing and think, we need that. Intelligence reports filtering back from the front lines make it clear. German soldiers are using stimulants, and it's giving them an edge. The United States military, always pragmatic, decides to fight fire with fire. If chemistry can win a war, then chemistry it is. American forces start distributing amphetamines, close chemical cousins of methamphetamine, to their troops. They call them go pills, a euphemism that makes them sound helpful rather than dangerous. And to be fair, in the short term, they are helpful. Bomber crews flying 12-hour missions over Europe take them to stay alert and focused. Fighter pilots use them to maintain sharp reflexes during dogfights. Ground troops on extended operations pop them to push through fatigue. The British military does the same thing. RAF pilots, especially those flying night missions during the Battle of Britain, use amphetamines to stay awake and alert. The drug becomes part of the standard toolkit, issued alongside rations and ammunition. It's not controversial. It's practical. Even the Japanese military, already deep into their own brutal war in the Pacific, distributes methamphetamine to soldiers. But nowhere is the use more extreme than among kamikaze pilots. These young men, sent on one-way missions to crash their planes into Allied ships, are often given massive doses of methamphetamine before their final flights. The drug eliminates fear, suppresses doubt, and creates a sense of invincibility. It's easier to fly into certain death when you're high out of your mind. The war ends in 1945 and millions of soldiers return home. They've spent years in combat, many of them using stimulants regularly. Some are addicted, though they don't necessarily realize it. They just know they feel better, sharper, more energetic when they take the pills. And conveniently, there's a massive surplus of military amphetamine stockpiles. Pills that were meant for soldiers are now flooding the civilian market. Pharmaceutical companies see an opportunity. They've been watching the military success with stimulants, and they smell profit. If amphetamines can keep soldiers awake and alert, surely they can help civilians too. Companies start marketing amphetamines for everything from depression to obesity to simple tiredness. The FDA approves them, doctors prescribe them, and just like that, the same drugs that fueled the war effort become household staples. Post-war America is booming, the economy is growing, suburbs are expanding, and a new middle class is emerging. But prosperity comes with pressure. People are expected to work hard, achieve more, climb higher. And if you need a little chemical assistance to keep up, well, that's just modern living. Amphetamines become the perfect drug for the American dream. They make you productive, they suppress your appetite, and they give you the energy to do it all without complaining. By the late 1940s, amphetamines are prescribed for depression, fatigue, weight loss, and even to children diagnosed with behavioral problems. The cultural momentum is unstoppable. What started as a military necessity has become a civilian lifestyle. The pills that won the war are now being sold to housewives, truck drivers, and students, and everyone thinks it's fine because it's legal, it's prescribed, and it's made by pharmaceutical companies with official-sounding names. Nobody's calling it a drug problem yet. It's medicine. It's progress. It's the future. The war may be over, but America's relationship with stimulants is just beginning. It's the 1950s, and if you're a woman in America, you're expected to be perfect. Not just good, perfect. Thin, cheerful, tireless, immaculate. You're raising children, cooking elaborate meals from scratch, keeping a spotless home, hosting dinner parties, volunteering at church, and looking like a magazine cover while doing all of it. Oh, and you're supposed to make it look effortless, like you were born to scrub floors in pearls and high heels. The pressure is crushing, and the medical establishment has a solution: diet pills, amphetamines and methamphetamines, marketed specifically to women under brand names like Obitrol, Disoxin, Benzedrine, and Dexedrine. Your doctor prescribes them without hesitation. After all, they're FDA approved. They're legal. They're medicine. The pitch is simple. Take a few pills a day and suddenly you'll have the energy to do everything expected of you. You won't be hungry, so those extra pounds will melt away. You'll be cheerful and productive. You'll be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect homemaker. And the best part, it's not your fault if you need help. Modern life is demanding. Science has given you a tool. Why wouldn't you use it? Millions of American women take the bait. They visit their doctors complaining of fatigue, weight gain, or just general unhappiness with their lives, and doctors, overwhelmingly male, hand them prescriptions like candy. In some cases, women don't even need to complain. Weight loss. Pills are advertised in women's magazines, on television, in beauty columns. The message is clear. If you're not thin and energetic, you're failing. But don't worry, there's a pill for that. The pills work, at least at first. You take your morning dose, and suddenly you're buzzing with energy. The house gets cleaned in record time. You organize closets you haven't touched in years. You cook dinner while simultaneously helping the kids with homework, darning socks, and planning next week's menu. You're not hungry, which is great because dieting is so much easier when food doesn't interest you. The pounds drop off. Your husband notices. You feel accomplished. But there are side effects. You're not sleeping well. When you do sleep, it's fitful and unsatisfying. Your jaw hurts from grinding your teeth. Sometimes your heart races for no reason. You're anxious, jittery, irritable. You snap at the kids over small things. You find yourself talking too fast, moving too fast, thinking too fast. But you push through because the alternative, being tired and fat and falling behind, seems worse. And then there's the tolerance problem. That one pill that used to give you energy all morning. Now it barely gets you through breakfast, so you take 2, then 3. You're refilling your prescription faster than you should, but your doctor doesn't seem concerned. He just writes another script. After all, you're not a drug addict. You're a respectable housewife taking medicine for a legitimate medical condition, being tired and overweight. By the late 1950s, amphetamine and methamphetamine prescriptions have reached epidemic levels. Women who would never touch alcohol or cigarettes are popping pills multiple times a day, every day. Some take them for years. They don't think of it as drug use, it's medication, it's self-care. It's how you survive being a 1950s housewife without losing your mind. Ironically, many of them are losing their minds. Some develop full-blown stimulant psychosis, hallucinating, paranoid, convinced their neighbours are plotting against them. Others just become hollowed-out versions of themselves, running on chemical energy with no real joy or rest. Their children grow up watching their mothers vibrate with anxious energy, cleaning the same counter 5 times, talking in rapid bursts, never quite present. The dark comedy of it all is that these women are taking methamphetamine, actual meth, to meet impossible standards set by a society that views them as decoration and domestic labour. They're being told to smile while their brains are being rewired by one of the most addictive substances ever created. And everyone pretends it's fine because a doctor prescribed it, because it's legal, because it's what respectable women do. The 1950s housewife, in her perfect kitchen with her perfect hair, is high. And nobody calls it a drug problem because she's not shooting up in an alley. She's swallowing pills from a pharmacy bottle. She's being the perfect woman. And perfection, as it turns out, requires chemicals. By the 1960s, amphetamines and methamphetamines aren't just for soldiers and housewives anymore. They've seeped into every corner of American life, becoming the chemical backbone of productivity culture. Truck drivers call them bennies, or West Coast turnarounds, and they rely on them to stay awake during grueling cross-country hauls. Long-haul trucking is brutal work. Days on the road, tight delivery schedules, pressure to keep moving. Sleep is a luxury you can't afford when you're paid by the mile, so drivers pop pills, lots of them. There are entire networks built around this. Truck stops sell them under the table. Drivers share them. Some even have doctors who'll write prescriptions, no questions asked. The pills keep you awake, keep you alert, keep the wheels turning. Nobody thinks twice about it. It's just part of the job, like coffee but stronger. College students discover the same thing. Finals week approaches and you've got 5 exams, 3 papers and no time to sleep. Enter amphetamines. Suddenly you can study for 20 hours straight. Your brain feels sharp, focused, unstoppable. You're retaining information at an incredible rate. You ace your exams and all it cost you was a few sleepless nights and a handful of pills you got from your roommate's prescription, or bought from that guy in your dorm who always seems to have them. This becomes normalized on college campuses across the country. Students aren't taking drugs, they're using study aids. It's different, they tell themselves. It's for productivity, not recreation. The fact that they're swallowing the same substance that Nazi soldiers used to invade France doesn't really come up in conversation. Factory workers on night shifts are doing it too. Working overnight messes with your body in ways that are hard to describe. You're awake when you should be asleep, tired when you should be alert, and your circadian rhythm is completely destroyed. Amphetamines fix that, or seem to. You take a pill at the start of your shift and suddenly you're awake, focused, capable of operating heavy machinery without nodding off. It's dangerous work done by exhausted people, and stimulants feel like a necessary evil. The pharmaceutical industry is raking in profits. By the mid-1960s, Americans are consuming billions of amphetamine pills annually. Not millions, billions. Pharmaceutical companies are producing them by the ton, and doctors are prescribing them for everything from weight loss to depression to hyperactivity in children. The cultural message is clear. Stimulants are tools. They help you work harder, study longer, stay thinner, be better. But cracks are starting to show. Emergency rooms are seeing more patients with heart palpitations, panic attacks, and full psychotic breaks. Some people are showing up with symptoms that look like schizophrenia, paranoia, hallucinations, erratic behavior. Doctors eventually figure out it's not mental illness, it's stimulant psychosis brought on by chronic amphetamine use. There are also the people who don't show up in emergency rooms, the ones who just quietly spiral. The truck driver, who's been taking pills for 10 years and can't function without them. The college student who graduates with honours but also with a chemical dependency. The factory worker who's been running on uppers so long he doesn't remember what normal energy feels like. Some doctors start raising alarms. Medical journals publish studies showing that amphetamines are addictive, that they cause serious health problems, that they're being overprescribed. But their warnings are drowned out by the sheer cultural momentum. Stimulants are productivity. Stimulants are success. Stimulants are the American way. And there's another problem lurking beneath the surface. The pills don't actually solve anything. They mask fatigue, but they don't provide real rest. They suppress appetite, but they don't address why someone might be struggling with weight. They create the illusion of limitless energy, but your body still has limits. It's just that now you can't feel them. You're running yourself into the ground, and the pills are convincing you that you're fine. By the late 1960s, America has millions of people quietly addicted to legally prescribed speed. They don't think of themselves as drug addicts. They're just people taking their medication, doing their jobs, meeting their obligations. But their bodies are screaming for the pills, their brains are rewired, and withdrawal, if they ever try to stop, is a nightmare of fatigue, depression, and desperate cravings. Nobody's calling it an epidemic yet, but it is one, and it's about to get worse. Here's the thing about stimulants. Your body builds tolerance faster than you can blink. That one pill that used to give you energy all day, now you need 2, then 4, then 6. Then you're taking them every few hours just to feel normal, just to avoid the crushing fatigue and depression that hits the moment they wear off. By the late 1960s, America has millions of people quietly addicted to legally prescribed amphetamines and methamphetamines, and most of them don't even realize it. They think they just need the medication. They tell themselves it's fine because a doctor prescribed it, but their bodies are telling a different story. Skip a dose, and you crash hard. You're exhausted beyond belief, depressed, unable to focus. Your brain feels like it's wrapped in cotton. Nothing interests you. Food doesn't taste right. Life feels grey and heavy. So you take another pill and another, and the cycle continues. The medical community is finally starting to notice. Reports of amphetamine addiction are piling up in medical journals. Studies show disturbing patterns. People taking doses far higher than prescribed. People doctor shopping to get multiple prescriptions. People exhibiting signs of dependency that look exactly like addiction to any other substance. Doctors are seeing patients who literally cannot function without their pills, who panic at the thought of running out, who exhibit withdrawal symptoms when they try to stop. And then there are the horror stories. A housewife in Ohio takes so many diet pills that she develops full-blown psychosis, convinced her neighbors are poisoning her food. She ends up in a psychiatric hospital. A truck driver in Texas, after years of popping bennies, has a heart attack at age 35. A college student studying for finals takes a handful of amphetamines, doesn't sleep for 4 days, and jumps out of a dormitory window during a psychotic break. These aren't isolated incidents. They're becoming common enough that the medical establishment can't ignore them anymore. In 1965, Congress passes the Drug Abuse Control Amendments, the first serious attempt to regulate amphetamines. Some formulations are restricted. Prescription requirements are tightened. Production limits are imposed on pharmaceutical companies. States start passing their own laws, making it harder to get prescriptions, limiting refills, cracking down on doctors who prescribe too freely. The FDA begins pulling certain amphetamine products off the market entirely. By the late 1960s, the golden age of legal speed is ending. Doctors are becoming more cautious about prescribing stimulants. Pharmacies are scrutinizing prescriptions more carefully. The cultural message is shifting from "these pills will help you" to "these pills are dangerous." And suddenly, people who've been taking these medications for years, housewives, truckers, students, factory workers, can't get them anymore. Their doctors cut them off, citing new regulations. Their prescriptions aren't renewed. They're told to just stop, often with no support, no tapering schedule, no understanding of what withdrawal will feel like. For many, it's devastating. They're not ready to stop. They don't want to stop. They need the pills, or at least their bodies are screaming that they need them. The withdrawal is brutal, crushing fatigue that lasts for weeks, depression so severe that getting out of bed feels impossible, an inability to feel pleasure from anything. Some people sleep for days, others can't sleep at all, lying awake with their minds racing but their bodies utterly exhausted. But here's where it gets darker. When the legal supply dries up, demand doesn't disappear, it just goes underground. People who've been taking prescription amphetamines for years suddenly find themselves looking for other sources. Some turn to the black market, buying pills from dealers instead of pharmacies. Others discover that if you know the right people, you can get methamphetamine that wasn't made by a pharmaceutical company, homemade stuff, cooked in illegal labs. This is the moment when the line between prescription medication and street drug begins to blur. The housewife who started with diet pills from her doctor might now be buying speed from her neighbour's cousin. The truck driver who relied on bennies from a pharmacy might now be picking up baggies of powder at a truck stop. They don't think of themselves as drug addicts. They're just people who need their medication and can't get it legally anymore. The infrastructure for illegal methamphetamine production is already starting to form. Small-time chemists realize there's a market for this. Outlaw motorcycle gangs see an opportunity. The recipe isn't complicated: ephedrine, some household chemicals, a little heat. If you know what you're doing, you can make methamphetamine in a basement or a garage, and there are millions of potential customers who've just been cut off from their legal supply. The transition is insidious. It doesn't happen overnight. But by the early 1970s, the landscape has shifted. Methamphetamine, which spent decades as a respectable pharmaceutical product, is beginning its transformation into a street drug. The people using it haven't changed. They're still trying to work harder, stay awake longer, lose weight, function in a demanding world. But now they're criminals, buying from criminals, because the same substance that was legal last year is illegal this year. And here's the cruelest irony. The government's attempt to solve the prescription amphetamine crisis by restricting legal access actually created the conditions for an even worse crisis. When you cut off millions of addicted people without providing treatment or support, They don't just quit. They find another source, and that source, increasingly, is the illegal methamphetamine trade that's about to explode. In the 1970s, methamphetamine production shifts from sterile pharmaceutical labs to grimy basements, garage operations, and the clubhouses of outlaw motorcycle gangs. This isn't corporate chemistry anymore. This is DIY drug manufacturing, and it's about to become a massive underground industry. The chemistry isn't particularly complicated, which is part of the problem. If you can follow a recipe and aren't afraid of potentially blowing yourself up, you can make methamphetamine. You need ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, some basic chemicals, red phosphorus, iodine, anhydrous ammonia, and a heat source. Mix them in the right order, control the temperature, and you end up with methamphetamine. It's dangerous, toxic, and illegal, but it's also profitable. Outlaw motorcycle gangs, especially the Hells Angels, are among the first to recognize the opportunity. They've been involved in various illegal enterprises for years, running drugs, guns, protection rackets, and meth fits perfectly into their business model. It's cheap to produce, easy to transport, and the profit margins are incredible. A few $100s in chemicals can yield thousands of dollars in product. The Hells Angels start cooking meth in California and distributing it along the West Coast. They control production, distribution, and enforcement with brutal efficiency. If you're cooking meth in their territory without permission, you have a problem. If you owe them money, you have a bigger problem. The product they're making is crude compared to pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine, often contaminated with toxic byproducts from incomplete reactions. But users don't care. It's cheap, it's available, and it gets you high. They call it crank, supposedly because bikers used to hide it in the crankcases of their motorcycles during transport. Whether that's true or legend doesn't really matter. The name sticks. Crank becomes the street term for methamphetamine, and it spreads through biker culture, truck stops, blue-collar communities, and anyone looking for cheap energy and escape. But the bikers aren't the only ones cooking. Basement chemists, people with just enough knowledge to be dangerous, start setting up small operations. Some are former pharmaceutical workers who know the chemistry. Others learn from underground manuals, word of mouth, or trial and error. These aren't professional operations. They're improvised setups in rental houses, trailers, motel rooms, anywhere you can close the door and not attract attention. The problem with amateur meth production is that it's incredibly hazardous. The chemicals involved are toxic, corrosive, and flammable. The fumes can kill you. The process can explode if you get the temperature wrong. Fires are common, chemical burns are common. People cook meth in their kitchen and end up in the hospital or the morgue, but the profit potential is so high that people keep trying anyway. By the mid-1970s, illegal meth labs are popping up all over the country, especially in California, the Southwest, and parts of the Midwest. Law enforcement is struggling to keep up. They'll raid a lab, arrest the cook, shut down the operation, and 2 more labs open the next week. It's like playing whack-a-mole, except the moles are producing a highly addictive stimulant that's flooding communities. The product quality is wildly inconsistent. Pharmaceutical meth was pure, predictable, dosed accurately. Street meth? Who knows what you're getting? The concentration varies, the purity varies. Sometimes it's cut with other substances, caffeine, ephedrine, random white powders, to stretch the supply. Sometimes it's contaminated with toxic byproducts like lead, mercury, or phosphorus compounds that can cause serious health problems. Users start experiencing side effects that go beyond normal stimulant effects. Kidney damage from contaminated product, neurological damage from heavy metal poisoning, violent psychosis triggered by high doses of impure meth. The drug that was once carefully manufactured under controlled conditions is now being cooked in someone's garage using instructions scrawled on notebook paper, and yet demand keeps growing. The people who got hooked on prescription amphetamines in the 1960s are now buying from dealers. They're joined by a new generation of users, labourers looking for energy to work double shifts, people trying to lose weight, partiers chasing a high, truckers still trying to stay awake on the road. The user base is diverse, cutting across class, race and geography. The government's response is predictably punitive. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 classifies methamphetamine as Schedule II, meaning it has medical uses but high potential for abuse. Penalties for manufacturing and distribution increase. Law enforcement starts targeting meth labs specifically, creating special task forces to shut them down. But here's the problem. For every lab they shut down, the price of meth goes up slightly, which makes it more profitable to cook, which encourages more people to start cooking. It's basic economics. High demand, restricted supply, massive profit, potential. Arresting individual cooks doesn't address the underlying market forces. By the end of the 1970s, methamphetamine has fully transitioned from a pharmaceutical product to a street drug. The biker gangs have established distribution networks. Basement chemists have refined their techniques. Users have learned to navigate the black market. And the stage is set for the next evolution, the discovery of an even easier way to make meth, one that will trigger an explosion of production that makes the 1970s look tame by comparison. The era of the respectable diet pill is over. The era of the meth lab has begun. And it's only going to get worse. For years, making methamphetamine required access to pure ephedrine, which was difficult to obtain. It was a controlled substance, monitored by regulators, tracked by law enforcement. If you tried to buy large quantities of ephedrine, you'd get noticed. Labs needed connections to chemical suppliers, often international ones, which added complexity and risk. And then someone realized something that changed everything. Pseudoephedrine, the active ingredient in over-the-counter cold medicines like Sudafed, works just as well. This is a game changer. Suddenly, you don't need a pharmaceutical supplier or a shady import operation. You just need to walk into a drugstore. Pseudoephedrine is in dozens of common cold and allergy medications, sitting on shelves in every pharmacy, grocery store and gas station in America. It's cheap, it's legal, and it's everywhere. All you need is a simple chemical process to convert pseudoephedrine into methamphetamine, and the recipes are spreading. By the late 1980s, meth cooks have figured out several methods. The most popular is called the Nazi method, or the Birch reduction, which uses pseudoephedrine, lithium from batteries, and anhydrous ammonia. Another method uses red phosphorus and iodine. The details vary, but the principle is the same. Over-the-counter cold medicine plus household chemicals equals methamphetamine. Meth production explodes. You don't need to be a trained chemist anymore. You don't need expensive equipment. You just need to buy a bunch of Sudafed, gather some basic supplies, and follow instructions that you can find in underground publications or increasingly on the early internet. The barrier to entry has dropped dramatically, and small-time cooks are setting up labs everywhere. Pharmacies start noticing strange patterns. People are buying massive quantities of cold medicine, 20, 30, 50 boxes at a time. They're not sick. They're not stocking up for winter. They're clearly buying it for something else. Pharmacy employees start asking questions, and the buyers get defensive or hostile. Some people start smurfing, recruiting multiple individuals to buy smaller quantities at different stores to avoid suspicion. They pay people to go store to store, buying the legal limit at each location, then pool the purchases. Law enforcement catches on. They start tracking pseudoephedrine sales, looking for patterns. If someone buys large quantities of cold medicine along with lithium batteries, matches, a source of red phosphorus, and camping fuel, a source of anhydrous ammonia, that's a pretty clear sign they're cooking meth. Police start staking out stores, watching for suspicious purchases, but the cat's already out of the bag. By the early 1990s, meth labs are everywhere, especially in rural areas where privacy is easier to come by and law enforcement is spread thin. Trailers in remote areas become meth factories. Farmhouses with outbuildings provide perfect cover. Even urban apartments are being used, despite the risk of neighbours noticing the chemical smell. The labs are incredibly dangerous. The cooking process produces toxic fumes that can cause respiratory damage, chemical burns, and chronic health problems. The chemicals themselves are hazardous, anhydrous. Ammonia can blind you, lithium reacts violently with water, and the whole setup can explode if something goes wrong. And things go wrong constantly. Meth lab explosions become a regular occurrence. Firefighters respond to scenes where the walls are blown out, chemical residue is everywhere, and the cook is either dead or horribly burned. Sometimes there are children in the house, exposed to toxic fumes and living in a chemical hazard zone. Child Protective Services start seeing a spike in cases related to meth production in homes. States begin passing laws to restrict pseudoephedrine sales. Oregon is among the first, requiring that pseudoephedrine products be kept behind the pharmacy counter. You have to ask for them, show ID, and your purchase is logged in a database. There are limits on how much you can buy per day and per month. Other states follow with similar laws. The pharmaceutical industry pushes back, arguing that these restrictions inconvenience legitimate customers who just want cold medicine. But the public health crisis is undeniable. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed with meth-related cases. Child welfare agencies are overwhelmed with children removed from meth labs. Fire departments are overwhelmed with lab explosions and chemical fires. By the late 1990s, the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act is introduced, creating a national framework for tracking and restricting pseudoephedrine sales. You have to show ID your purchase is logged electronically. There are strict limits. Violations carry serious penalties. The goal is to make it harder to obtain the raw materials for meth production. And it works, kind of. Meth lab incidents drop in areas with strict pseudoephedrine controls. Small-scale domestic production becomes more difficult, but the demand for meth hasn't gone anywhere. The market is still there, massive and growing, and nature abhors a vacuum. When domestic production becomes harder, international suppliers step in to fill the gap. Mexican drug cartels have been watching this entire evolution with great interest. They see a massive profitable market for methamphetamine in the United States. They see domestic production becoming more difficult and risky. And they realize they can produce meth on an industrial scale in professional labs south of the border and smuggle it into the US far more efficiently than basement cooks can produce it domestically. The pseudoephedrine crackdown successfully reduces small-scale domestic meth production, but it also shifts the market toward a far more dangerous source, the cartels. The mom-and-pop meth labs are shutting down, but they're being replaced by super labs producing hundreds of pounds of pure methamphetamine at a time. The epidemic isn't ending, it's industrializing. While American basement cooks are making batches of meth in dirty kitchens using cold medicine and battery acid, Mexican drug cartels are thinking bigger, much bigger. They're looking at the US methamphetamine market and seeing an opportunity that dwarfs even the cocaine trade. Meth is cheaper to produce, easier to manufacture, and the demand is insatiable. So they start building super labs. These aren't amateur operations. These are industrial-scale facilities with trained chemists, professional equipment, and access to bulk chemicals imported from China, India, and other countries, with less stringent export controls. The cartels aren't using pseudoephedrine from cold medicine. They're buying pure ephedrine or phenyl 2-propanone, P2P, a different precursor chemical, by the ton. They're not following recipes scrawled on notebook paper. They're employing chemists with degrees who understand the synthesis at a molecular level. The scale is staggering. A superlab can produce hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine in a single cook. Some produce over 1,000 pounds. The purity is consistently high, often 90% or better, far exceeding the quality of domestic batches. And the cost per unit is incredibly low because of economies of scale. The cartels can flood the US market with high-quality meth at prices that undercut every domestic producer. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, cartel meth is everywhere. It's being smuggled across the border in cars, trucks, tunnels, boats, even ultralight aircraft. The cartels have sophisticated distribution networks that move product from labs in Mexico to distributors across the United States. They use the same routes and methods developed for cocaine and heroin, but meth is in many ways easier, it doesn't require agricultural production, it's not climate dependent, and you can make massive quantities in a relatively small facility. The impact on the US meth market is immediate and dramatic. Domestic meth cooks can't compete. The cartel product is cheaper, purer, and more consistently available. Small-time cooks who are making a few ounces at a time are being driven out of business by suppliers who can move pounds, even kilos at lower prices. The mom-and-pop meth labs start disappearing, not because of law enforcement pressure alone, but because they simply can't compete economically. For users, this is both good and bad. Good because the meth is purer and less likely to be contaminated with toxic byproducts from amateur chemistry. Bad because it's more potent, more addictive, and far more available. Prices drop, purity increases, the barriers to access fall away. You used to have to know a guy who cooked. Now you just need to know a dealer, and there are dealers everywhere. The cartels treat methamphetamine production like any other business. They optimize supply chains, manage distribution networks, and maximize profit margins. They invest in better production methods. They hire chemists to develop more efficient synthesis routes. They establish relationships with chemical suppliers in China who can provide precursors in bulk. They build redundancy into their operations so that shutting down one lab barely impacts overall production. And they're ruthless about protecting their business. The meth trade becomes incredibly violent. Rival cartels fight for control of production facilities and smuggling routes. Distributors who skim product or money disappear. Informants are killed, often brutally, as warnings to others. The violence spills across the border into US cities where cartel distributors operate. Law enforcement is completely overwhelmed. The DEA and Border Patrol agencies are seizing massive quantities of methamphetamine, multi-hundred-pound loads, even multi-ton seizures, but it barely makes a dent in the overall supply. For every shipment intercepted, dozens more get through. The cartels have the resources to absorb losses that would cripple smaller operations. A seized shipment is just a cost of doing business. By the mid-2000s, Mexican superlabs are producing the vast majority of methamphetamine consumed in the United States. Domestic production still exists. There are still small labs scattered across rural America, but they account for a small fraction of the total supply. The meth epidemic has been industrialized, professionalized, and internationalized, and the consequences are catastrophic. Communities that were already struggling with poverty, unemployment, and social problems are flooded with cheap, high-quality meth. Addiction rates soar. Crime increases. Families fall apart. Emergency rooms see wave after wave of meth-related cases. Treatment facilities are overwhelmed. Foster care systems buckle under the weight of children removed from addicted parents. The cartels don't care about any of this. They're not ideological. They're not trying to destroy communities. They're just following market incentives. There's demand, they're supplying it, and they're making billions of dollars. The human cost is irrelevant to the business model. By the 2010s, the methamphetamine crisis, in the United States is no longer primarily a domestic production problem. It's an international drug trafficking problem, driven by sophisticated criminal organizations with resources that rival small countries. The pseudoephedrine restrictions successfully reduced kitchen labs, but they didn't reduce meth use. They just changed where the meth comes from. The epidemic hasn't been solved, it's been outsourced. Meth doesn't just ruin your life, it rewrites your face, and it does it with horrifying speed. By the early 2000s, law enforcement agencies are seeing this pattern over and over. People arrested for meth-related crimes look decades older than their actual age. Their mugshots tell a story of rapid physical destruction that's almost difficult to believe. Someone recognizes this as a powerful prevention tool. In 2004, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office in Oregon launches the Faces of Meth campaign. The concept is simple but devastating. Show before and after mugshots of meth users. The images are shocking. A fresh-faced 20-year-old woman becomes a gaunt, scarred, toothless 40-year-old in just 3 years. A healthy-looking young man turns into a hollow-eyed spectre, with open sores and sunken cheeks in 18 months. The transformation is so dramatic that sometimes it's hard to believe the photos are of the same person. The campaign goes viral, long before going viral is even a common phrase. The images are picked up by news outlets, shared on early social media, used in schools and prevention programs. They're undeniably effective at conveying the physical toll of meth addiction. But they also reveal something deeper. What meth does to the human body is brutal and visible. Let's talk about meth mouth, one of the most recognizable signs of chronic use. Users develop severe dental decay, often losing most or all of their teeth. The causes are multiple. Meth causes dry mouth by reducing saliva production, and saliva is crucial for protecting teeth. Users often crave sugary drinks while high, bathing their teeth in acid and sugar. They grind their teeth compulsively, and they neglect basic hygiene, sometimes not brushing for days or weeks. The result is catastrophic dental damage. Teeth rot from the inside out. They turn black, break apart, fall out. The pain is excruciating, but users often don't seek dental care because they can't afford it. They're too paranoid, or they're too focused on getting the next high. By the time they're arrested or hospitalized, their mouths are disaster zones. Then there's the skin. Meth users develop a distinctive appearance: sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, open sores covering their face and body. The sores come from formication, the sensation of bugs crawling under your skin. It's a common meth-induced hallucination, and users respond by picking and scratching obsessively. They dig at their skin with fingernails, tweezers, anything sharp, convinced they're removing insects. The wounds become infected, heal poorly, and scar permanently. The picking can become compulsive, lasting for hours. Users describe it as both horrifying and impossible to stop. They know logically that there are no bugs, but the sensation is so real that they can't help themselves. Some pick until they've created craters in their skin. The scars are permanent, visible markers of addiction that no amount of recovery can fully erase. Weight loss is another signature of meth use. Methamphetamine is a powerful appetite suppressant. That's why it was prescribed as a diet pill for decades. But chronic users don't just lose a few pounds, they waste away. 150-pound people drop to 90, 80, 70 pounds. Their faces become skeletal, their bones protrude. They look like victims of famine. The aging effect is real and measurable. Studies show that chronic meth use causes premature aging at the cellular level. It damages blood vessels, reducing blood flow to the skin. It increases oxidative stress, breaking down collagen and elastin. It disrupts sleep, and the body can't repair itself properly. Users look 10, 15, 20 years older than their actual age. A 25-year-old meth addict can easily look 45. The Faces of Meth campaign is designed to scare people away from trying the drug, and to some extent it works. The images are so disturbing that they create a visceral reaction. But there's a darker side to the campaign. It also dehumanizes users. The photos are often shared with mocking comments, turned into memes, used as entertainment. The people in those photos aren't just statistics. They're someone's child, sibling, parent, friend. They're human beings suffering from addiction, not circus freaks. For people already addicted, the campaign doesn't help. They're not looking at prevention posters. They're looking for their next hit. And if they do see the images, the message they receive isn't "you should quit." It's "you're disgusting, you're hopeless, you're beyond saving." Shame doesn't cure addiction. It often makes it worse, driving people deeper into isolation and use. But the images do serve one purpose. They make the invisible visible. Meth addiction happens in the shadows, in trailers, cheap motels, abandoned buildings. The Faces of Meth campaign drags it into public view, forcing people to confront what this drug actually does. It's not a fun party drug. It's not harmless. It's a chemical that will hollow you out, age you prematurely, and destroy your body in ways that are visible to everyone who looks at you. The faces in those photos tell stories of addiction, desperation, and loss. They're warnings, yes, but they're also memorials to people who got caught in a trap they couldn't escape. Some of them eventually got clean, many didn't. But every photo represents a life that intersected with methamphetamine and was never the same. While cities are grappling with cartel-supplied meth flooding in from Mexico, rural America faces a different nightmare. Homemade meth labs in trailers, farmhouses, abandoned buildings, and even motel rooms. These aren't professional operations. They're desperate addicts cooking small batches using instructions downloaded from the internet, trying to feed their own habit or make a little money. And they're everywhere. In some rural counties during the peak of the domestic meth crisis in the mid-2000s, meth lab incidents outnumber every other type of crime combined. Sheriffs in small towns are responding to meth lab calls weekly, sometimes daily. Firefighters are dealing with meth lab explosions and chemical fires. Child protective services are removing children from homes contaminated with toxic chemicals. Let's talk about what a meth lab actually looks like. Forget Breaking Bad's sleek RV setup. Real meth labs are filthy, chaotic, and incredibly dangerous. They're set up in kitchens, bathrooms, bedrooms, sheds, garages. The cook is usually an addict, often high while cooking, following a recipe that may or may not be accurate. Equipment is improvised. Soda bottles, coffee filters, plastic tubing, electric hot plates, coolers filled with ice. The chemicals involved are hazardous in ways that are hard to overstate. Anhydrous ammonia, used in one popular cooking method, is a toxic gas that can cause severe respiratory damage and blindness. It's kept under pressure in tanks or extracted from fertilizer. Lithium, stripped from batteries, reacts violently with water or moisture in the air. Red phosphorus from matchboxes, iodine, drain cleaner, camping fuel. The ingredient list reads like a recipe for environmental disaster. The cooking process releases toxic fumes. Hydrogen chloride gas, phosphine gas, ammonia vapor, all of them harmful to breathe, all of them filling the space where the lab is operating. People cooking in their homes are exposing themselves and anyone else in the building to these toxins. Children are found in homes where meth is being produced, breathing chemical fumes, touching contaminated surfaces, living in an environment that's literally poisonous. And then there are the explosions. Meth labs explode with shocking regularity. The cooking process involves volatile chemicals and heat, and one small mistake, too much heat, a spark, a chemical reaction gone wrong, can trigger an explosion or fire. Buildings are blown apart, people are burned alive, neighbours' homes are damaged. First responders arrive to find chemical fires that can't be extinguished with normal methods. toxic smoke, and sometimes bodies. Even after a lab is shut down, the contamination remains. Methamphetamine residue and toxic byproducts seep into walls, carpets, furniture, ventilation systems. The cleanup requires specialized hazmat teams and can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Many contaminated properties are simply abandoned because the cleanup costs more than the property is worth. Entire neighborhoods can be impacted by a single meth lab. Law enforcement officers responding to meth labs face serious risks. The chemicals are toxic. The people cooking are often armed, paranoid, and high. Booby traps are common, tripwires connected to shotguns, explosives rigged to doors. Officers have to approach with extreme caution, wearing protective gear, treating every lab scene as both a crime scene and a hazmat situation. The strain on small-town emergency services is immense. Rural police departments with a handful of officers are dealing with multiple active meth labs in their jurisdiction. Fire departments are responding to meth-related fires and explosions with equipment designed for normal house fires, not chemical disasters. Hospitals are treating burns, chemical exposure, and the long-term health effects of living near or in meth labs. Children are the most heartbreaking victims. By the mid-2000s, thousands of children are being removed from homes where meth is present, either because it's being cooked there or because their parents are using. These children are exposed to toxic chemicals, neglect, instability, and often trauma. They witness violence, experience hunger, and grow up in environments where their basic needs aren't met because their parents are addicted. Foster care systems in rural states are overwhelmed. There aren't enough foster families to take in all the children being removed from meth-related situations. Social workers are carrying impossible caseloads. Children end up in group homes, bounce between placements, or placed with relatives who may also be struggling with addiction. Some communities fight back with aggressive enforcement, creating meth task forces, conducting raids, arresting cooks and dealers, but it's like playing whack-a-mole. You shut down one lab, two more pop up, you arrest one cook, someone else starts cooking. The underlying conditions that drive people to meth, poverty, lack of opportunity, hopelessness, don't change just because you arrest people. By the late 2000s, the pseudoephedrine restrictions and increased enforcement start to reduce domestic meth lab incidents. The number of labs discovered and dismantled drops significantly, but the meth problem doesn't go away. It just shifts. Domestic production declines as Mexican super labs fill the gap. The meth doesn't disappear from these communities. It just starts coming from a different source. Small-town America, which was already struggling economically, has been devastated by the meth epidemic in ways that will take generations to repair. Communities have lost young people to addiction, children to foster care, and property to chemical contamination. The social fabric has been torn, trust has eroded, and the scars remain, visible in abandoned homes, broken families, and an entire generation that grew up in the shadow of the meth crisis. In 2008, a television show premieres on AMC that will become one of the most critically acclaimed series in television history. Breaking Bad tells the story of Walter White, a high school chemistry teacher who turns to cooking methamphetamine after being diagnosed with cancer. The show is gripping, brilliantly written, and meticulously researched. It doesn't glamorize meth. It shows the horror, the violence, the moral decay, the human cost. But it also makes the science fascinating, the characters compelling, and the world of methamphetamine production strangely captivating. The timing is almost eerie. Breaking Bad airs just as the domestic meth lab crisis is peaking and beginning to transition to cartel-dominated supply. The show captures this moment perfectly, showing a small-time cook trying to compete in a market increasingly controlled by larger, more ruthless operations. Walter White's journey from amateur to empire builder mirrors in exaggerated form, the evolution of the American meth trade itself, the show's creator, Vince Gilligan, and his writers do their homework. They consult with DEA agents, chemists, and former meth cooks to get the details right. The chemistry shown on screen is mostly accurate, deliberately not quite complete, so it couldn't be used as an actual recipe, but accurate enough to feel real. The production methods, the equipment, the precursor chemicals, the dangers, all portrayed with a level of authenticity that's both impressive and slightly terrifying. Suddenly, everyone knows what pseudoephedrine is. People who've never thought about methamphetamine production understand the basic concept. Terms like cook, super lab, RV lab, and blue meth enter the cultural vocabulary. The show makes the invisible visible, bringing a crisis that's been ravaging rural America into the living rooms of millions of people who've never personally encountered it. But the show's impact is complicated. On one hand, it serves as a kind of dark public service announcement. The show doesn't shy away from showing what meth does to people. Jesse Pinkman's girlfriend choking to death on her own vomit. Children neglected by addicted parents. Users with rotting teeth and destroyed lives. The violence and paranoia that permeates the drug trade. Anyone watching Breaking Bad and thinking that looks fun hasn't been paying attention. On the other hand, the show inadvertently becomes a how-to guide. Law enforcement reports cases of people citing Breaking Bad as inspiration. Some try to replicate Walter White's methods. Police find printouts of scenes from the show in raided meth labs. The show's attention to detail, meant to create authenticity, also provides a blueprint for anyone curious enough to try. There's also the Walter White problem. The character is written as an anti-hero. We watch his moral descent, his transformation from mild-mannered teacher to ruthless drug lord. But he's also brilliant, resourceful, and in the early seasons somewhat sympathetic. Some viewers root for him, admire his ingenuity, see him as a power fantasy, the underdog who takes control of his life through forbidden knowledge and ruthless execution. This creates a cultural phenomenon that's unsettling. Walter White Halloween costumes. I am the one who knocks t-shirts, memes celebrating his criminal genius. The show's creators intended Walter to be a cautionary tale, a character whose choices lead to destruction. But a significant portion of the audience misses that message entirely, instead idolizing him as a badass. The blue meth, the show's visual signature, a way to differentiate Walter's product from competitors, becomes iconic. Real-life dealers start selling blue-tinted methamphetamine, capitalizing on the show's popularity. It's marketing. Pure and simple. The blue color doesn't indicate higher quality. It's just food coloring or copper sulfate added to look like the show. But people buy it because they recognize the reference. Law enforcement has mixed feelings about the show. Some agents appreciate that it's bringing attention to a crisis that's been largely ignored by mainstream media. The meth epidemic has been ravaging communities for years, but it doesn't get the same coverage as crack cocaine or heroin. Breaking Bad puts it on the map. But the show also makes meth production seem more accessible, more achievable. It demystifies the process in ways that could inspire imitators. Education programs start using clips from Breaking Bad to illustrate the dangers of meth. The show becomes a teaching tool, despite being fiction. The scenes of Jesse Pinkman spiraling into addiction, of families destroyed, of violence erupting from the drug trade, these resonate more powerfully than statistics or prevention posters. The emotional impact is undeniable. But here's the deeper truth. Breaking Bad works because it taps into something real. The economic desperation that drives Walter White to cook meth mirrors the economic desperation in communities actually ravaged by the drug. The sense of powerlessness, of being trapped by circumstances, of needing money for medical bills or family needs. These are real pressures that real people face. The show exaggerates and dramatizes, but the underlying conditions are authentic. When Breaking Bad ends in 2013, it's left an indelible mark on popular culture. It sparked conversations about addiction, drug policy, healthcare, economic inequality, and the American dream gone wrong. It's made methamphetamine a household topic in ways that decades of public health campaigns never achieved. And it's created a complicated legacy, a show that simultaneously warns against the meth trade and makes it endlessly fascinating. The show's influence extends beyond entertainment. Researchers study its impact on public perceptions of drug use. Policymakers reference it in debates about drug enforcement and treatment. And in living rooms across America, people who never thought much about methamphetamine suddenly have opinions informed by a fictional, character-cooking blue meth in an RV. Breaking Bad didn't create the meth epidemic, but it gave it a face, a story, and a cultural moment. And in doing so, it brought a real crisis into the realm of fiction, blurring the lines in ways that are still being felt today. To combat the explosion of meth production fueled by pseudoephedrine, states across America start passing increasingly strict laws regulating cold medicine sales. What follows is a cat-and-mouse game between law enforcement, pharmacies, and meth cooks that plays out in the aisles of drugstores across the country. The first wave of restrictions seems reasonable. Move pseudoephedrine products behind the pharmacy counter. No more grabbing a box of Sudafed off the shelf. Now you have to ask the pharmacist, show your ID, and have your purchase logged in a database. There are limits, usually 1 or 2 boxes per purchase, monthly caps on total purchases. The idea is simple. If you need cold medicine for a legitimate cold, these restrictions are a minor inconvenience. If you're buying it to cook meth, you're going to have a problem, and it works initially. Meth lab incidents drop in states with strict pseudoephedrine controls. Cooks can't just walk into a store and buy 50 boxes anymore. The easy access is gone, but demand for meth hasn't decreased, and where there's demand, there's always someone willing to figure out how to meet supply. Enter smurfing. The term comes from the little blue cartoon characters, but in drug slang it means recruiting multiple people to make small purchases that stay under the legal limits. A meth cook might recruit 10 people to each buy 2 boxes of Sudafed from different stores. Pool those purchases together, and you've got enough pseudoephedrine for a decent-sized cook. Smurfs are often addicts themselves, paid in meth or small amounts of cash. Some are desperate people willing to do anything for money. Others are coerced or manipulated. The cook sends them out with a list of stores, specific instructions on what to buy, and sometimes even rides along to multiple pharmacies in a single day, coordinating a team of buyers. Pharmacies catch on quickly. They start recognizing faces. Someone who bought the limit yesterday is back today with a different ID. Suspicious. Someone buying cold medicine in the middle of summer? Red flag. Multiple people coming in separately but buying the same product? Definitely suspicious. Pharmacy staff become amateur detectives, watching for patterns, refusing sales when something feels off. Some pharmacists go further, taking photos of suspected smurfs and sharing them with other stores. They create informal networks, warning each other about known buyers. In small towns, this works surprisingly well. There are only so many pharmacies, and the staff talk to each other. But in larger cities, there are too many stores, too many buyers, too much volume. The smurfing operations become more sophisticated. Cooks start recruiting people from outside the area, bringing them in specifically to buy cold medicine. They target stores in different towns, different counties, sometimes even different states. They use fake IDs or stolen identities. They pay people to get legitimate prescriptions for pseudoephedrine products, which aren't subject to the same restrictions. Law enforcement responds with technology. Many states implement electronic tracking systems that log all pseudoephedrine purchases in real time. When someone tries to buy cold medicine, the pharmacist scans their ID, and the system checks whether they've already hit their monthly limit, not just at this store, but anywhere in the state. If they have, the sale is blocked. This is remarkably effective. Cooks can't just hop between stores anymore. The system follows them. If they've bought their limit in City A, they can't go to City B and buy more. The statewide tracking creates a unified enforcement mechanism that's much harder to evade. But again, the cooks adapt. They start using other people's IDs, buying or stealing them from people who aren't using their allotment. They recruit smurfs from states without electronic tracking and send them into states with restrictions. They find doctors willing to write prescriptions for pseudoephedrine, claiming chronic sinus problems or allergies. They exploit every loophole, every weakness in the system. Pharmacists become exhausted. They're supposed to be dispensing medication and counselling patients, but now they're also gatekeepers in a drug war, making judgment calls about who's legitimately sick and who's cooking meth. They deal with angry customers who don't understand why they need to show ID for cold medicine. They face threats from people whose sales they refuse. Some pharmacists in rural areas where meth is a serious problem report feeling genuinely unsafe. By 2006, the Federal Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act creates a nationwide framework for pseudoephedrine restrictions. Now the rules are standardized across all states. ID required, purchase limits enforced, sales logged electronically. Pseudoephedrine products must be kept behind the counter or in locked cases. The penalties for violations are severe for both sellers and buyers. The impact is undeniable. Between 2005 and 2010, domestic meth lab incidents dropped dramatically. In some states, the number of labs discovered falls by 50% or more. The restrictions work. Meth cooks can't get the raw materials as easily. The small-scale kitchen labs that plagued rural America are shutting down. But here's the problem. The restrictions reduce supply without reducing demand. People who are addicted to meth don't stop using just because domestic production becomes harder. They find other sources. And conveniently, right as domestic labs are shutting down, Mexican cartels are ramping up super lab production and flooding the market with cheap, high-purity crystal meth. The pseudoephedrine wars succeed in their stated goal, reducing domestic meth production. But they don't succeed in reducing meth use. They just change the supply chain. The meth epidemic shifts from a domestic production crisis to an international trafficking crisis. The mom-and-pop labs disappear, but they're replaced by industrial operations producing methamphetamine by the ton. For legitimate cold medicine users, the restrictions are a permanent inconvenience. You can't just grab Sudafed off the shelf anymore. You have to show ID, get logged in a database, and accept purchase limits that might leave you stuck if you actually get sick at the end of the month and you've already bought your allotment. The pharmaceutical industry responds by developing phenylephrine-based cold medicines that don't contain pseudoephedrine and therefore aren't restricted. They market these aggressively as convenient alternatives. There's just one problem. Phenylephrine doesn't work as well as pseudoephedrine. Studies eventually show it's barely more effective than placebo, but it's on the shelves, unrestricted, so people buy it anyway. By 2010, the smurfing wars have largely been won by law enforcement and pharmacies. Electronic tracking systems are in place. Purchase limits are enforced. Small-scale domestic meth production has declined significantly. But the meth epidemic hasn't ended. It's just evolved, moving from kitchen labs to super labs, from domestic production to international smuggling. The war on pseudoephedrine proves something important. You can restrict access to precursor chemicals. You can shut down domestic production. You can make it harder to cook meth in your kitchen. But as long as the demand exists, supply will find a way. And that supply, increasingly, is coming from across the border in quantities that make the old kitchen labs look quaint. By the 2010s, the vast majority of methamphetamine consumed in the United States doesn't come from domestic labs. It comes from Mexico, produced in industrial superlabs and smuggled across the border in quantities that are difficult to comprehend. The cartels have turned methamphetamine into a billion-dollar industry, and they've built an infrastructure to support it that rivals legitimate corporations. Let's start with production. The superlabs are located in remote areas of Mexico, rural states like Sinaloa, Michoacán, and Jalisco. These aren't backyard operations. They're sophisticated facilities with professional equipment, trained chemists, and access to industrial quantities of precursor chemicals. The cartels import phenylacetone, P2P, and other chemicals from China, India, and other countries by the ton, often through shell companies and false shipping manifests. The scale is staggering. A single superlab can produce hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine per cook, and they're cooking continuously. Some labs operate 24/7 with multiple production lines running simultaneously. The efficiency is remarkable. They've optimized every step of the process to maximize yield and minimize waste. The purity of the final product is consistently high, often 90% or better. Now comes the logistics, getting hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine from labs in Mexico to users across the United States. The cartels use every method imaginable. Hidden compartments in vehicles, false gas tanks, hollowed-out tires, secret panels in doors and floors, commercial trucks crossing at legal ports of entry, with meth hidden among legitimate cargo, private vehicles driven by people who look normal, carrying personal use amounts that might not draw attention. Then there are the more elaborate methods. Tunnels under the border, some of them hundreds of yards long, equipped with ventilation, lighting, even rail systems for moving product. Ultralight aircraft flying low over the border at night, dropping packages in predetermined locations. Drones, especially in recent years, flying packages directly over the fence. Boats and submarines, yes, actual submarines, moving product along the coast. The cartels have distribution networks that span the entire country. Major cities have cartel representatives who receive bulk shipments and distribute to local dealers. From there, the meth filters down through multiple levels, from kilogram dealers to ounce dealers to gram dealers to users. Each level takes a cut, diluting the purity slightly, raising the price incrementally. The money flows back south just as efficiently as the drugs flow north. Millions of dollars in cash are smuggled back across the border, often using the same routes and methods. The cartels have money laundering operations, legitimate businesses, currency exchanges, shell companies that clean the proceeds and integrate them into the legal economy. Law enforcement is fighting a losing battle. The DEA, Customs and Border Protection, state and local police, they seize massive quantities of methamphetamine, multi-hundred-pound loads, multi-ton shipments. In 2019, CBP seizes over 67,000 pounds of meth at the southwest border alone. That sounds impressive until you realise it's probably less than 10% of what actually crosses. The cartels have resources that law enforcement can't match. They can absorb losses that would cripple other organisations. A seized shipment is just a cost of doing business, already factored into their profit calculations. They have spotters watching border crossings, reporting on law enforcement presence. They have corruption networks, people on the payroll in both Mexico and the US, providing intelligence, facilitating crossings, looking the other way. And they're ruthless about protecting their business. The Mexican drug war, which escalates dramatically in the 2000s and 2010s, is driven largely by cartel competition, overproduction, and smuggling routes. Tens of thousands of people are killed. Entire towns are terrorized. Journalists who report on cartel activity are murdered. Politicians who can't be bribed are assassinated. The violence occasionally spills across the border. Distributors in US cities who owe money or steal product are killed, sometimes brutally, as warnings to others. Cartel operatives are active in American cities, coordinating distribution and enforcing cartel interests. Law enforcement finds evidence of cartel presence in places you'd never expect. Small towns in the Midwest, rural areas in the South, suburbs where drug trafficking seems unlikely. The business model is remarkably efficient. The cartels produce meth for a few $100s per pound and sell it wholesale in the US for several $1,000s per pound. Retail prices vary, but by the time it reaches users, that pound of meth might generate $20,000 to $30,000 in revenue. The profit margins are extraordinary, and here's the thing, the cartels don't care about the human cost. They're not ideological. They're not trying to destroy American communities. They're following market incentives. There's massive demand for methamphetamine in the United States. They're supplying that demand and making billions of dollars. The addiction, the overdoses, the destroyed families, the ruined lives, that's not their concern. That's just externalities in a business model. The impact on US communities is catastrophic. Meth is cheaper and more available than ever before. In the early 2000s, a gram of meth might cost $100 or more. By the mid-2010s, prices have dropped to $20, $10, sometimes even less in areas where supply is high. Lower prices mean greater accessibility, which means more users, which means more addiction, which means more demand, which incentivizes more production. It's a vicious cycle, and it's accelerating. Methamphetamine seizures at the border keep increasing, purity keeps going up, prices keep dropping, and addiction rates keep climbing. The cartels have industrialized the meth trade, turning it into a streamlined, efficient, ruthlessly profitable enterprise, and law enforcement, despite massive resources and aggressive efforts, is barely slowing them down. The border is too long, the methods too varied, the incentives too powerful. For every tunnel discovered and shut down, another is already under construction. For every shipment seized, a dozen more get through. The meth epidemic in America is no longer a domestic problem. It's an international crisis, driven by sophisticated criminal organizations that operate like corporations, with resources that rival small nations and a ruthlessness that law enforcement struggles to counter. The supply chain from Mexican superlabs to American users is efficient, resilient, and incredibly difficult to disrupt. And as long as demand exists, the cartels will keep producing, keep smuggling, keep flooding American communities with a drug that destroys everything it touches. In the 2010s, the form of methamphetamine dominating the US market undergoes a shift. Powder meth, the traditional form, which looks like white or off-white powder, is increasingly replaced by crystal meth, also known as ice. Chemically, they're the same substance, methamphetamine, but the crystalline form is purer, more potent, and delivers a faster, more intense high. Crystal meth looks different. Instead of powder, it comes in large glass-like shards or crystals that resemble ice or broken glass. It's transparent or slightly cloudy, and it has a distinctive appearance that's immediately recognizable. The crystallization process requires more skill and better equipment than producing powder, which is why it's mostly coming from professional superlabs rather than amateur kitchen operations. The purity is the key difference. Powder meth from domestic labs often had purity levels of 40 to 60%, sometimes lower, cut, with various fillers and contaminated with chemical byproducts. Crystal meth from superlabs routinely tests at 90 to 98% purity. That's pharmaceutical grade quality, produced with professional equipment and quality control that rivals legitimate chemical manufacturing. Users notice the difference immediately. Higher purity means stronger effects from smaller doses. The high hits faster, feels more intense, lasts longer. For someone used to lower purity powder, their first experience with high purity crystal can be overwhelming. It's like drinking grain alcohol when you're used to beer. The potency is shocking. The preferred method of use also shifts. While meth can be snorted, injected, or swallowed, crystal meth is most commonly smoked. Users heat the crystals in a glass pipe, and the meth vaporizes, producing smoke that's inhaled directly into the lungs. Smoking delivers the drug to the brain within seconds, faster than snorting, almost as fast as injection. The rush is immediate and intense. Smoking meth changes the addiction profile. The rapid delivery creates a more immediate and powerful reinforcement cycle. The high peaks quickly, then crashes, creating an intense craving for another hit. Users describe a compulsive cycle. Smoke, feel the rush, ride the high, crash, immediately want to smoke again. The cycle can repeat dozens of times in a single binge, with users going through grams of meth in hours. The physical effects are devastating. Smoking meth causes severe dental damage. The heat, the chemicals, the dry mouth, all contribute to rapid tooth decay. Lung damage is common, especially with long-term use. Users develop chronic coughs, respiratory infections, and sometimes permanent damage to lung tissue. But the most frightening effect is psychological. High-purity crystal meth is incredibly addictive. The intense highs and corresponding crashes create powerful cravings that are difficult to resist. First-time users sometimes report feeling addicted after a single use. While that's not technically addiction requires repeated use and physiological dependence, it speaks to the power of the experience. People try it once and immediately want more. The shadow side, paranoia, hallucinations, psychosis, becomes more common with crystal meth. The higher potency combined with marathon binge sessions creates ideal conditions for stimulant-induced psychosis. Users stay awake for days, sometimes weeks, smoking continuously. Sleep deprivation combined with high doses of stimulants scrambles brain chemistry. People start seeing things that aren't there, shadow people, bugs, threats. They become paranoid, convince people are watching them, following them, plotting against them. Emergency rooms see a dramatic increase in meth-related psychiatric cases. People arrive in full psychotic states, violent, terrified, completely detached from reality. They're seeing demons, hearing voices, convinced they're being persecuted. Sedating them is difficult. Their hearts are racing, their blood pressure is dangerously high, and they're often combative. Some require physical restraints and heavy sedation just to keep them from hurting themselves or others. The overdose risk increases too. While methamphetamine overdose is less common than opioid overdose, it happens. High doses can cause hypothermia, body temperature spiking to dangerous levels, heart attacks and strokes, especially in people with underlying cardiovascular issues, seizures, multi-organ failure from prolonged stimulant toxicity, and there's no reversal drug for meth overdose like there is for opioids. Treatment is supportive. Cool the body, manage the heart rate, prevent seizures, and hope the person survives. By the mid-2010s, crystal meth has essentially replaced powder meth in most US markets. The cartels have perfected production, and users prefer the higher quality. Prices remain low despite the higher purity, a consequence of mass production and efficient distribution. The cost per high is incredibly low compared to other drugs, which makes meth attractive to people with limited resources. The demographic using meth also expands. It's not just rural white communities anymore, though they're still heavily affected. Urban areas see increasing meth use. Communities of colour, previously more associated with crack cocaine or heroin use, start seeing meth appear. The LGBTQ+ community, particularly gay and bisexual men in urban areas, experiences a surge in meth use connected to the chemsex scene. The crystal meth era represents a new phase in the methamphetamine epidemic. The drug is more potent, more addictive, more available, and cheaper than ever before. The cartels have industrialized production. The purity is consistently high. The distribution networks are mature and efficient, and the human toll is accelerating. More addiction, more overdoses, more psychosis, more destroyed lives. This isn't the Pervitin your grandmother took to lose weight. This isn't even the crank from biker gangs in the 1970s. This is industrial-grade methamphetamine, produced at scale, distributed efficiently, and optimized for addiction. The Ice Age has arrived, and it's colder than anyone imagined. While America's attention fixates on the opioid epidemic, OxyContin, prescription pills, heroin, and eventually fentanyl, methamphetamine is quietly surging. The opioid crisis dominates headlines, drives policy discussions, and attracts funding for treatment and prevention. Politicians declare it a national emergency. Documentaries are made. Families share their stories. The country is finally paying attention to addiction, but they're mostly looking in the wrong direction. Because while everyone's focused on opioids, meth use is skyrocketing, and the two epidemics aren't separate, they're intertwined in ways that make both more dangerous. Some users are mixing meth and opioids in what's called a speedball or goofball. The combination involves taking a stimulant and a depressant together, balancing their effects. Meth keeps you awake and energized, while opioids provide euphoria and pain relief. Heroin users add meth to counteract the sedation. Meth users add opioids to smooth out the jittery, anxious edge of the high. This combination is incredibly dangerous. The drugs work against each other in ways that disguise overdose symptoms. The stimulant can mask how much respiratory depression the opioid is causing. Users think they're fine because they're awake and alert, not realizing their breathing is dangerously slow. When the stimulant wears off, the full weight of the opioid hits, and they stop breathing. Then there are people who turn to meth after getting clean from opioids. Opioid addiction treatment has improved significantly. Medications like methadone and buprenorphine can stabilize people, reduce cravings, prevent withdrawal, but those treatments don't address the underlying issues that led to addiction in the first place: trauma, mental health problems, economic desperation, social isolation. Some people get off opioids and find themselves facing the same pain, the same emptiness, the same unbearable reality they were trying to escape. So they turn to a different drug. Meth offers a different kind of escape: energy instead of sedation, confidence instead of numbness. It fills the void that sobriety leaves, at least temporarily. The tragic irony is that while the opioid crisis gets attention and resources, naloxone distribution, medication-assisted treatment programs, harm reduction initiatives, the meth crisis is largely ignored. There's no medication to treat meth addiction, no reversal drug for overdose. Treatment options are limited to behavioral therapy and support groups, which work for some people but have high failure rates. Funding for meth addiction treatment and prevention remains scarce. Politicians don't talk about it. It doesn't generate the same sympathetic media coverage. The opioid crisis has been framed as a tragedy affecting regular people, suburban families, middle-class communities. Meth is still stigmatized as a drug used by those people: rural poor, criminals, degenerates. And then fentanyl enters the meth supply. This is where the two epidemics collide in the most horrifying way possible. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 5,100 times more potent than morphine, starts appearing in methamphetamine. Sometimes it's contamination, labs that produce both drugs using the same equipment without proper cleaning. Sometimes it's deliberate, dealers cutting meth with fentanyl to increase addictiveness, or simply because they're sloppy with their product handling. The result is catastrophic. Meth users expecting a stimulant high suddenly overdose on an opioid they didn't know they were taking. They're not prepared for it. They don't have naloxone on hand because they're not opioid users. They don't know to watch for respiratory depression. They're alone, they stop breathing, and they die. Overdose deaths involving both meth and fentanyl spiked dramatically in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Public health officials scramble to get the message out. Test your drugs, carry naloxone even if you only use meth, never use alone. Harm reduction organizations distribute fentanyl test strips alongside clean needles and naloxone kits. But the message is difficult to spread because meth users aren't as connected to harm reduction services. The infrastructure built to address the opioid crisis, syringe exchanges, naloxone distribution, overdose prevention sites, is mostly used by opioid users. Meth users, especially those who smoke rather than inject, aren't accessing these services. They don't see themselves as part of the drug user community that needs harm reduction. And then they die from fentanyl contamination they never saw coming. The data tells the story. In 2015, there are about 5,000 overdose deaths involving methamphetamine in the US. By 2019, that number has more than tripled. Many of those deaths involve fentanyl as well. The meth epidemic, which was already severe, is now being amplified by the opioid crisis. Meanwhile, communities already struggling with opioid addiction now face a second wave. The treatment infrastructure designed for opioid addiction isn't equipped for meth. Medication-assisted treatment doesn't work for meth. The counselling and support groups struggle to address the different psychological patterns of meth addiction versus opioid addiction. First responders, already overwhelmed by opioid calls, now face methamphetamine emergencies too. People in psychosis, violent and unpredictable, or experiencing cardiac events, strokes, seizures. The emergency medical response required for meth overdose is different from opioid overdose, requiring different interventions and creating additional strain on systems already stretched thin. The two epidemics feed each other, creating a public health catastrophe that's more than the sum of its parts. But because the attention and resources are focused on opioids, the meth crisis continues to grow in the shadows, claiming lives, destroying families, and devastating communities that are already barely hanging on. By 2020, it's undeniable. While America was fighting one addiction crisis, another one was quietly becoming just as deadly. The opioid epidemic gets the headlines, the funding, the policy attention. The meth epidemic gets what's left over, which is never enough. Let's talk about what methamphetamine actually does to your brain, because understanding the mechanism helps explain why meth addiction is so devastating and so difficult to overcome. This isn't about morality or willpower. This is about neuroscience, about how a chemical hijacks your brain's reward system and fundamentally alters the way you experience pleasure, motivation, and reality itself. Your brain operates on neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that carry signals between neurons. One of the most important is dopamine, which is central to your brain's reward system. Dopamine is released when you do something pleasurable or beneficial, eating food when you're hungry, having sex, achieving a goal, spending time with people you love. It creates feelings of pleasure and satisfaction, and it reinforces behaviors by making you want to repeat them. Under normal circumstances, dopamine is released in controlled amounts and then reabsorbed by the neurons that released it, a process called reuptake. This creates a balanced cycle of reward and return to baseline. Pleasurable activities create modest dopamine spikes, maybe double or triple your baseline levels, and then your brain returns to normal. Methamphetamine obliterates this balance. When you use meth, it floods your brain with dopamine, not double or triple baseline levels, but 10 to 12 times normal. It's not just releasing more dopamine, it's also blocking the reuptake mechanism, so the dopamine stays in your system longer, creating a prolonged, intense high that's far beyond anything your brain was designed to experience. The rush that meth users describe isn't exaggeration. It's a real, measurable neurochemical event. Your brain is being flooded with pleasure signals at levels that natural rewards can't even approach. Food, sex, accomplishments, none of them come close to producing the dopamine surge that meth creates. Your brain's reward system is essentially being told that methamphetamine is the best thing that has ever happened to you, more important than anything else in life. This is where the addiction mechanism begins. With repeated use, your brain adapts to this chemical assault through a process called downregulation. The neurons that receive dopamine signals start reducing the number of dopamine receptors they produce. It's a protective response. Your brain is trying to compensate for the excessive stimulation by becoming less sensitive to it. But this creates a cruel trap. Now you need meth just to feel normal. Natural rewards, food, relationships, hobbies, which used to produce modest dopamine releases and feelings of pleasure, now barely register. Your downregulated receptors can't respond adequately to normal dopamine levels. Nothing feels good anymore except meth. This is why meth addicts describe life without the drug as unbearably grey and empty. It's not psychological weakness or depression in the normal sense. Their brains have been physically altered. The neural pathways that once allowed them to experience pleasure from normal activities have been damaged. They're neurologically incapable of feeling good without the drug. The cravings aren't just mental either. They're driven by powerful changes in brain structure. Methamphetamine affects the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and planning. Imaging studies show that chronic meth use causes actual structural changes in this region, reducing grey matter density and disrupting normal function. What this means in practical terms, even when someone desperately wants to quit, even when they understand the consequences, the damaged prefrontal cortex makes it nearly impossible to translate that understanding into action. The impulse control that would normally help you resist cravings is compromised. The ability to weigh long-term consequences against short-term gratification is impaired. There's also evidence that meth causes neurotoxicity, actual damage to dopamine-producing neurons. Some studies suggest that this damage might be partially reversible with long-term abstinence, but recovery is slow and incomplete. After months or even years clean, former meth users still show reduced dopamine function compared to people who never used. The cognitive effects extend beyond the reward system. Chronic meth use damages areas involved in memory, learning, and executive function. Users develop problems with attention, decision-making, and impulse control that persist long after they stop using. Memory formation is impaired. Cognitive processing slows. These deficits can interfere with work, relationships, and daily functioning, making it even harder to build a life in recovery. Then there's the psychological toll. Chronic meth use can trigger lasting psychiatric symptoms that resemble schizophrenia, paranoia, hallucinations, delusions. Some users develop meth-induced psychosis that persist for months or years after they stop using. The question of whether meth causes permanent psychotic disorders or just triggers latent predispositions is still being researched, but the practical outcome is the same. People whose mental health is permanently damaged by the drug. Sleep deprivation, common among heavy meth users, compounds all these effects. Users sometimes stay awake for days or even weeks during binges. Prolonged sleep deprivation causes its own set of neurological problems: cognitive impairment, hallucinations, paranoia, impaired immune function. When you combine chronic sleep deprivation with the direct neurotoxic effects of meth, you create a perfect storm of brain damage. The cardiovascular effects add another layer of risk. Methamphetamine dramatically increases heart rate and blood pressure. It constricts blood vessels, reducing blood flow to the brain. Over time, this can cause small strokes, damage to brain tissue from reduced oxygen, and cognitive decline that looks similar to dementia. Here's the devastating conclusion. Meth addiction isn't a choice in any meaningful sense. By the time someone is addicted, their brain has been fundamentally altered. The structures responsible for decision-making and impulse control are damaged. The reward system is broken. Natural sources of pleasure don't work anymore, and the cravings are driven by powerful neurochemical processes that willpower alone can't overcome. Recovery requires time, months to years, for the brain to begin healing. It requires behavioral therapy to build new coping mechanisms and teach the damaged prefrontal cortex how to resist impulses. It requires environmental changes to remove triggers and create new, healthier patterns. And even with all of that, relapse rates remain high because the neurological changes are so profound. This is why saying just quit to a meth addict is like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. The mechanism is damaged. The system doesn't work normally anymore. And fixing it, if it can be fixed at all, requires time, support, and interventions that go far beyond individual willpower. Methamphetamine doesn't just get you high. It rewires your brain at a fundamental level, creating changes that can persist for years or become permanent. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does explain why meth addiction is so difficult to overcome and why treatment needs to address not just behavior, but the underlying neurobiology that's been so profoundly disrupted. In certain urban LGBTQ+ communities, particularly among gay and bisexual men, methamphetamine becomes intertwined with sex in a practice known as chemsex or party and play, often abbreviated as PNP. This intersection of drug use and sexual activity creates a crisis within a crisis, a pattern of addiction that's both chemical and behavioral, difficult to treat, and often hidden beneath layers of stigma and shame. The appeal is initially straightforward. Methamphetamine lowers inhibitions, increases libido, enhances sensory experience, and allows sexual activity to continue for hours or even days. Users report feeling more confident, more attractive, more connected to partners. For people who've struggled with internalized homophobia, body image issues, or social anxiety, problems that disproportionately affect LGBTQ+ individuals, meth offers temporary relief. It makes sex feel easier, better, less complicated by insecurity or fear. The chemsex scene develops its own culture, particularly in large cities like San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, and London. It's organized through apps and websites, often using coded language. PNP, party favor, clouds, skiing. Users connect online, meet up, use meth together, and engage in sexual activity that can last for extended sessions. Sometimes it's 2 people, sometimes it's groups. The scenarios vary, but the pattern is consistent. Meth plus sex, repeated in marathon sessions. But what starts as recreational quickly becomes compulsive. The combination of meth's neurological effects and the dopamine release from sexual activity creates an incredibly powerful reinforcement cycle. The brain associates sex with the intense high of meth, and soon neither feels satisfying alone. Users describe needing meth to enjoy sex, and needing sex to fully experience the meth high. The two become inseparably linked. The health consequences are severe. Chemsex increases the risk of HIV transmission dramatically. Meth impairs judgment, making users less likely to use condoms or practice safer sex. It increases risky sexual behaviors, multiple partners, anonymous encounters, practices that carry higher transmission risk. And the marathon sessions mean extended exposure. HIV rates in communities with high chemsex participation are significantly elevated. Even for users on PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, medication that prevents HIV infection, the risks remain high. Other sexually transmitted infections spread rapidly. Syphilis, gonorrhea, hepatitis C, antibiotic-resistant strains of bacterial infections. Public health officials in cities with active chemsex scenes report STI rates that are difficult to control because the behaviour patterns are so conducive to transmission. The addiction pattern is particularly insidious. Unlike users who take meth for energy or weight loss and gradually develop dependence, chemsex users are pairing the drug with sex from the beginning. The behavioural and chemical addictions develop simultaneously, reinforcing each other. Treatment becomes complicated because you're not just addressing drug addiction, you're addressing a learned association between substances and intimacy that's been powerfully reinforced. Psychological damage accumulates. Users describe feeling unable to connect with partners without drugs. Sober sex feels boring, anxiety-inducing, impossible. Relationships suffer because intimacy becomes dependent on being high. Some users report that after extended periods of chemsex use, they can't maintain erections without meth, can't feel attracted to partners, can't experience pleasure from sex at all unless they're using. The social isolation deepens the problem. Many chemsex users are ashamed of their behaviour, hiding it from friends, family, and even romantic partners. They maintain double lives, professional functional personas in public, and chaotic drug-fueled sexual marathons in private. The secrecy prevents them from seeking help because acknowledging the problem means acknowledging behaviour they're deeply ashamed of. The LGBTQ+ community itself struggles with how to address the crisis. There's tension between sex-positive culture, which rightly celebrates sexual freedom and rejects shame, and the reality that chemsex is destroying lives. How do you warn people about dangerous behaviour without reinforcing stigma around gay sex? How do you promote safer practices without moralising or pathologizing sexuality? Public health campaigns try to walk this line, focusing on harm reduction. If you're going to engage in chemsex, use condoms, get tested regularly, don't share pipes or needles, have naloxone available in case of fentanyl contamination, never use alone. The message is pragmatic rather than prohibitionist, acknowledging that people will engage in these behaviours and trying to reduce the worst outcomes. Treatment programs specifically designed for chemsex users are rare. Most addiction treatment isn't equipped to address the specific dynamics of meth use tied to sexual behaviour. Therapists need specialised training to help clients rebuild their sexuality without drugs, address the underlying issues, trauma, internalised homophobia, loneliness, that made chemsex appealing in the first place, and develop healthier patterns of intimacy and connection. The intersection with mental health is significant. Depression, anxiety, and PTSD are all more common in LGBTQ+ populations due to minority stress, the cumulative effect of discrimination, rejection, and marginalization. Meth offers temporary escape from these conditions, but it ultimately makes them worse. The depression that follows a meth binge is crushing. The anxiety becomes paranoia. Existing mental health conditions are amplified. And there's the overlay of intergenerational trauma. The LGBTQ+ community, particularly gay men, lost an entire generation to the AIDS crisis. The survivors carry trauma from watching friends and lovers die, from being stigmatized and abandoned, from fighting for basic healthcare and recognition. Some scholars and activists argue that patterns like chemsex are partly rooted in this unresolved collective trauma, ways of coping with loss, fear, and pain that have been passed down through community networks. Recovery from chemsex addiction requires addressing multiple layers: the chemical addiction to meth, the behavioral patterns around sex, the underlying mental health issues, the social isolation, and often the trauma that predates the drug use. It's complex, difficult work, and the resources available are inadequate to meet the need. By the 2010s and 2020s, chemsex has become a recognised public health crisis within LGBTQ plus communities in major cities. Organisations like the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, GMHC in New York, and similar groups across the country develop specific programs targeting chemsex users. Support groups form, treatment protocols are developed, but the crisis persists, hidden in plain sight, affecting thousands of people who are often invisible to mainstream addiction services. The tragedy is that a community already facing discrimination, health disparities, and social marginalization is being hit by an addiction crisis that exploits vulnerabilities created by those very conditions. And the solutions require not just addiction treatment, but broader social changes, reducing stigma, improving mental health access, fostering community connection, addressing the underlying conditions that make escape through drugs and sex feel necessary in the first place. Chemsex isn't just about methamphetamine, it's about loneliness, shame, desire, community, trauma, and the complicated ways that human beings try to connect, to feel, to escape, and sometimes to destroy themselves in the process. One of the most heartbreaking consequences of the methamphetamine epidemic is what it does to children. Not the users themselves, but the children born to them, raised by them, and ultimately removed from them when addiction makes parenting impossible. By the 2010s, methamphetamine has become the leading cause of child removals in many states, overwhelming foster care systems that were already stretched beyond capacity. Let's start with prenatal exposure. Pregnant women using meth expose their developing fetuses to the drug. Methamphetamine crosses the placental barrier easily, meaning the fetus experiences the same neurological effects as the mother. Studies show associations with premature birth, low birth weight, small head circumference, and developmental delays. Some infants are born going through withdrawal, showing signs of distress, agitation, and difficulty feeding. The long-term effects of prenatal meth exposure are still being studied, but early research suggests increased risk of attention problems, learning difficulties, and behavioral issues. These children often start life at a disadvantage, with neurological impacts from drug exposure compounded by the chaotic, unstable environments they're typically born into. Then there are the children living in homes where meth is being used or produced. Imagine being a child in a house where your parents are high for days at a time, not sleeping, not eating, exhibiting paranoid and erratic behavior. There's no predictable routine. Meals are irregular or non-existent. Basic hygiene is neglected. The emotional environment is terrifying. Parents who are loving one moment become angry, paranoid, or completely checked out the next. Children in meth-involved homes often take on inappropriate responsibilities. A 7-year-old feeds and diapers their younger siblings because mum hasn't gotten out of bed in 2 days. A 10-year-old learns to recognize when dad is high and to stay quiet, stay out of the way, stay invisible. These children grow up fast, learning survival skills that no child should need. The physical danger is real. Meth labs in homes expose children to toxic chemicals. Kids develop respiratory problems, chemical burns, and chronic health issues from breathing fumes and touching contaminated surfaces. When labs explode, children are caught in the blast, burned, or killed. First responders describe arriving at lab scenes and finding children's toys scattered among chemical containers, cribs in rooms filled with toxic fumes, toddlers with chemical burns. Neglect is pervasive. Parents high on meth don't feed their children regularly, don't maintain safe living conditions, don't notice when kids are sick or hurt. Children show up at school hungry, dirty, wearing the same clothes for weeks. Teachers notice bruises, signs of malnutrition, developmental delays. They make reports to Child Protective Services, and the machinery of intervention begins when children are removed, and removal becomes necessary when parents can't or won't stop using. They enter a foster care system that's already overwhelmed. In states hit hard by the meth epidemic, the number of children in foster care has doubled or even tripled. There aren't enough foster families to take them all. Siblings are separated. Children are placed in group homes or bounce between temporary placements. The trauma of removal, even from a dangerous home, is significant. These children often love their parents despite the chaos. Being removed feels like punishment, like abandonment. They don't understand why strangers are taking them away from the only family they know. And the system they enter, while meant to be protective, is often re-traumatizing in its own way. Foster care itself is difficult under the best circumstances. For children coming from meth-involved homes, it's particularly challenging. Many have behavioral problems stemming from trauma, neglect, and instability. They act out, have difficulty trusting adults, struggle in school. Some have been so parentified, forced into adult roles at young ages, that they resist accepting care from foster parents. Others have attachment issues, unable to form healthy bonds after years of unreliable parenting. Foster families, often unprepared for the level of need these children present, struggle. Some placements break down. Children are moved again, accumulating more trauma with each disruption. The most troubled children, those with the most severe behavioral issues, end up in therapeutic group homes, the least family-like and most institutional settings. Social workers carry impossible caseloads. In counties heavily impacted by meth, a single worker might manage 40, 50, even 60 cases. They're supposed to monitor children's safety, support foster families, work with biological parents toward reunification, coordinate services, attend court hearings, and document everything. The system is perpetually in crisis mode, triaging rather than truly helping. Reunification, the goal of returning children to their parents once the home is safe, is complicated by the nature of meth addiction. Unlike some substances, there's no medication-assisted treatment for meth. Recovery requires behavioral therapy, support groups, and often long-term residential treatment. Relapse rates are high. Parents get clean, get their kids back, relapse, and the children are removed again. Some children go through this cycle multiple times, each removal more traumatic than the last. The court system becomes overwhelmed too. Dependency hearings, review hearings, permanency hearings. The legal process moves slowly while children wait in limbo. Judges make impossible decisions with incomplete information, terminate parental rights too quickly, and you're permanently severing families that might have recovered with more time. Wait too long, and you're leaving children in foster care for years while parents cycle through treatment and relapse. Some children never go home, parents can't or won't get clean, rights are terminated, and children become available for adoption. But older children, especially those with behavioral issues or sibling groups that need to stay together, are difficult to place. They age out of foster care at 18, often without having found permanent families, launched into adulthood without the support systems most young people rely on. The intergenerational effects are devastating. Children who grow up in the chaos of parental meth addiction are at higher risk of developing substance use disorders themselves. They've experienced trauma that affects brain development, making them more vulnerable to mental health problems and addiction. This cycle threatens to repeat unless interventions break it. By the mid-2010s, some states are seeing modest improvements as domestic meth production declines and prevention efforts ramp up. But the damage to a generation of children is already done. Tens of thousands of kids have been removed from homes, traumatized, scattered through foster care. Their outcomes, educational achievement, mental health, economic stability, relationships, are statistically worse than their peers who grew up in stable homes. The meth epidemic didn't just destroy individual lives, it fractured entire families, separated parents and children, and created cascading trauma that will echo through generations. And the children, who didn't choose any of this, who were just born into bad circumstances, carry scars that may never fully heal. In the 2020s, a new horror emerges in the methamphetamine crisis: fentanyl contamination. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, starts appearing in the meth supply with increasing frequency. The results are predictable and catastrophic. Meth users expecting a stimulant high suddenly overdose on an opioid they didn't know they were taking. The contamination happens in several ways. Sometimes it's cross-contamination in labs or during packaging. Dealers who handle both meth and fentanyl use the same scales, cutting surfaces and baggies without cleaning between substances. Microscopic amounts of fentanyl, amounts too small to see, end up in meth packages. For a meth user with no opioid tolerance, even a tiny amount of fentanyl can be lethal. Sometimes the contamination is deliberate, though the reasons vary. Some dealers cut meth with fentanyl because it's cheap and highly addictive. Users attribute the extra euphoria and compulsion to higher quality meth and come back for more. Others do it simply because they're sloppy, careless, or indifferent to the consequences. The profit margin on both drugs is high enough that cutting costs through contamination makes economic sense, even if it kills customers. The problem is that meth users aren't prepared for opioid overdose. If you're using heroin or fentanyl, you probably know about naloxone, Narcan, the opioid reversal drug. You might carry it, or your friends might have it. You know the signs of overdose: slow breathing, blue lips, unresponsiveness. But if you're a meth user, you're not thinking about opioid overdose. You're expecting to get high, feel energized, maybe stay up all night. You're not watching for respiratory depression. The result: meth users overdose alone, at home or in cars or motel rooms, with no one around to administer naloxone or call for help. By the time they're found, they've been dead for hours, sometimes days. The overdose deaths don't always get classified correctly in statistics. If meth and fentanyl are both in the system, is it a meth death or an opioid death? The categories blur, but the outcome is the same. People are dying from drugs they didn't know they were taking. Public health officials scramble to respond. Harm reduction organizations distribute fentanyl test strips, small, cheap, easy-to-use strips that detect fentanyl in drug samples. The message: test every batch before using. If it tests positive for fentanyl, either don't use it or proceed with extreme caution. Have naloxone available, don't use alone. But distribution of test strips is patchy and politically fraught. Some states classify them as drug paraphernalia, making possession illegal. Harm reduction is already controversial, providing clean needles, safe consumption spaces, testing supplies, and adding test strips to the mix faces opposition from people who see it as enabling drug use rather than preventing death. Naloxone distribution expands beyond opioid users. Health departments and harm reduction organizations try to get naloxone into the hands of anyone who uses drugs, regardless of their substance of choice. Free naloxone kits are available at pharmacies, health clinics, and through community organizations. The pitch: carry it even if you don't use opioids, because you never know what's in your supply. Some meth users resist this message. They don't see themselves as at risk. I don't use opioids, they say, not understanding that the fentanyl isn't a choice, it's contamination. Convincing them to carry naloxone and test their drugs requires overcoming both denial and the stigma of being associated with opioid use. The data is grim. Overdose deaths involving both methamphetamine and synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl, increased dramatically starting around 2017 to 2018, and accelerate into the early 2020s. In some states, the number of these co-involved deaths doubles or triples within just a few years. The meth epidemic, which was already severe, is now supercharged by the deadliest drug in the opioid crisis. Law enforcement finds this nearly impossible to address. You can't tell by looking whether a batch of meth is contaminated. Testing every seizure for fentanyl reveals how widespread the problem is, but it doesn't prevent it. The supply chains are too distributed, the sources too numerous. Mexican superlabs producing both fentanyl and meth sometimes use the same facilities, increasing cross-contamination risk. By the time product reaches street-level dealers, it's passed through multiple hands, been repackaged several times, and could be contaminated at any point. Users describe paranoia beyond the normal stimulant-induced kind. Every time they use, there's now the possibility of sudden death from contamination. Some start testing meticulously. Others adopt the fatalistic view that risk is just part of the game. Still, others are in such desperate addiction that the possibility of fentanyl contamination doesn't change their behavior. They need the drug, regardless. Harm reduction advocates push for broader interventions. Safe consumption sites where people can use drugs under medical supervision, ready to intervene in case of overdose. But these face massive political opposition, and most of the US critics see them as condoning drug use, giving addicts a place to get high. Advocates counter that they save lives and connect people with treatment, but the debate remains polarized. The fentanyl and meth crisis highlights a fundamental problem with prohibition and unregulated drug markets. Users have no way to know what they're actually getting. If you buy alcohol, the bottle tells you the percentage. If you get a prescription, the pill is standardized. But illicit drugs? You're trusting criminals to provide a consistent, uncontaminated product, and that trust is often fatal. Some harm reduction advocates argue for decriminalization or regulated supply, letting users obtain drugs of known purity and composition, eliminating the contamination risk. Portugal's decriminalization model, which treats drug use as a health issue rather than criminal one, shows promise in reducing overdoses and increasing treatment access. But in the US, such approaches remain politically untenable in most jurisdictions. Meanwhile, people keep dying. Meth users who survived years of addiction, who avoided overdose and psychosis and all the other risks, are killed by fentanyl they didn't know they were taking. It's Russian roulette every time they use, and the odds keep getting worse as contamination becomes more widespread. The contamination crisis represents the collision of two epidemics, meth and fentanyl, creating a combined threat more deadly than either alone. And the solutions, to the extent they exist, require accepting harm reduction principles that much of American society still rejects, that people will use drugs, that keeping them alive is more important than punishing them, and that in an unregulated market, information and safety tools are the only thing standing between users and death. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your warm bed with your prescription medications safely locked away, and your Sudafed requiring an ID to purchase, maybe take a moment to think about the long, strange journey of methamphetamine. From a Japanese chemistry lab in 1893 to Nazi blitzkrieg fuel, to your grandmother's diet pills to Breaking Bad to the fentanyl-contaminated street drug devastating communities right now, it's been quite a raid for one little molecule. The story of meth is a reminder that nothing is ever simple. A chemical synthesized with pure scientific curiosity became a pharmaceutical miracle, then a wartime necessity, then a housewife's helper, then a trucker's companion, then a biker gang's cash crop, then a cartel's billion-dollar product, and finally a public health catastrophe. At every stage, people thought they were doing something reasonable, helping soldiers stay alert, helping women lose weight, helping workers stay productive, making money, escaping pain. and at every stage the cost accumulated in ways nobody fully predicted. The methamphetamine epidemic isn't just about a drug. It's about what happens when profit motives override safety, when we treat human suffering as a moral failure instead of a health crisis, when we criminalize instead of treating, when we abandon entire communities economically and then act surprised when they turn to drugs for income and escape. Meth didn't destroy rural America, economic policies did. Meth just filled the void that was left behind. And here's what's haunting about this whole story. It didn't have to be this way. At every fork in the road, we could have chosen differently. We could have prescribed more carefully. We could have built treatment infrastructure. We could have addressed poverty and trauma. We could have chosen compassion over punishment. But we didn't. And millions of people paid the price for choices they didn't make, caught in a crisis they didn't create. The people struggling with meth addiction right now aren't villains. They're not weak or immoral or broken beyond repair. They're human beings whose brains have been chemically hijacked by one of the most addictive substances ever created. Some of them started with legal prescriptions from doctors they trusted. Some turned to meth to cope with poverty or trauma or pain. Some made a bad choice once and found themselves trapped by neurobiology they couldn't escape. Their stories are as varied as America itself. And the children caught in this crisis, the ones born exposed, the ones raised in chaos, the ones removed from homes and scattered through foster care, they didn't choose any of this. They're just kids trying to survive circumstances that no child should face. When we talk about the meth epidemic, we need to remember them too. They're the ones who'll carry these scars into the future, unless we finally decide to break the cycle. But there is hope, even in this dark story. The researchers working on vaccines and medications, the harm reduction workers handing out fentanyl test strips and naloxone without judgment, the people who've gotten clean and stayed clean, rebuilding their lives one difficult day at a time, the communities coming together to demand better treatment options, more resources, actual help instead of just handcuffs and jail cells. Change is possible. It's just hard, expensive, and requires admitting we've been wrong about almost everything. History has a way of revealing uncomfortable truths. The meth epidemic has revealed that America is willing to sacrifice entire communities on the altar of capitalism, that we're better at punishment than compassion, that we'll watch people die preventable deaths rather than embrace harm reduction strategies that actually work, that we'll spend trillions on a drug war that doesn't work rather than millions on treatment that does. But history also shows that we're capable of change when we finally decide to care. Polio is gone because we vaccinated everyone. Seatbelts save lives because we made them mandatory. Smoking rates dropped because we changed social norms and restricted marketing. We're capable of solving public health crises when we treat them as public health crises instead of moral crusades. So maybe the legacy of methamphetamine doesn't have to be endless suffering. Maybe it can be the crisis that finally taught us to do better, to see addiction as disease, not sin, to treat people with dignity, not contempt, to address the conditions that create desperation instead of just criminalizing the desperate, to choose evidence over ideology, compassion over cruelty, treatment over incarceration. That's the future we could build if we wanted to. Whether we will is another question entirely. But for now, tonight, you can rest easy knowing that you live in a time with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, building codes that prevent meth lab explosions next door, and pharmacists who watch out for smurfing operations. You can be grateful for naloxone distribution, fentanyl test strips, and the slowly growing understanding that addiction is a health issue that deserves compassion and care. You can appreciate that some people are fighting to make things better, even if progress is slower than it should be. And maybe, just maybe, you can extend a little empathy to the millions of people caught in the methamphetamine crisis right now. They're not statistics. They're not headlines. They're human beings, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, people who laugh and cry and hope and hurt. They're struggling with a drug that rewired their brains in a society that offers punishment instead of help, facing a future that feels impossible without the very substance that's destroying them. Their story is part of America's story. The meth epidemic is part of our collective history, our shared failure, and potentially our opportunity for redemption if we finally choose to learn from it. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, remember that history isn't just something that happened to other people in other times. It's happening right now. And the choices we make today about how we treat people struggling with addiction, how we fund treatment and prevention, how we address poverty and trauma, those choices will echo through generations, just like the choices made by that Japanese chemist in 1893, or those German pharmaceutical executives in 1938, or those doctors in the 1950s prescribing diet pills like candy. We're all part of this story. The question is what role we'll play in how it ends. Sleep well. And maybe tomorrow, think about what kind of ending you'd like to see. Because history may be full of suffering and mistakes and tragedies, but it's also proof that people can change, systems can improve, and even the darkest chapters can eventually give way to something better, if we're willing to do the work. Good night.